Well, hey everybody, welcome to Avocado Labs. And again, I'm really excited to be here. This is a really fun opportunity for me to speak to all of you. So thanks for joining in. A little bit about myself really quickly. Again, my name is Alyssa Miller. I'm a hacker and a researcher first and foremost. I've been working on computers all my life. I actually bought myself my first computer when I was 12 years old and taught myself basic programming. So yeah, I'm kind of a recovering developer, or I don't know, maybe you decide. But I'm also a security advocate. I work for a company called Sneak, and really my focus is on bringing the security message to essentially the world, but in particular, getting security better aligned with our development processes. Being a former developer, I have a special love for application security in particular. And I feel like security could do a lot better in interacting with our DevOps pipelines and so forth. So a lot of the work that I do right now, especially as a part of Sneak, is trying to drive a lot of those messages and sharing ideas, hearing other people's ideas, and just seeing how we can all become maybe a little better at what we're trying to do. I'm also an author and a blogger. I blog both on behalf of Sneak and I run my own blog, although it's unfortunately at the moment kind of wildly out of date. I don't think I've posted a blog in quite a while. COVID and all that crazy stuff. I'm also working on writing a book, so that takes more time away from blogging. And then finally, I am a podcast host. I co-host the Uncommon Journey podcast on ITSP Magazine, where we really just focus on people's really unique journeys into where they are in tech. But as Anna mentioned, today I'm talking to you about this thing we call threat modeling. And this whole topic for me got started a couple of years ago. I was working as a consultant with this organization that had a really good threat modeling program. They had really refined it. They had very standard processes and they were really efficient. And part of the process was getting together in these collaborative meetings and then producing some deliverables that they then, was ultimately the result of their threat model. And I remember coming out of one of these meetings and this developer who I'd worked with a number of times comes up to me and we start talking and he says to me, I can't wait until we don't have to do this anymore. And I was stunned. I looked at him and I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're moving to a DevOps pipeline, so threat modeling doesn't work with DevOps. And I got to thinking, he's right. Like a lot of people look at it that way. But we need threat modeling. Threat modeling is important. So how do we get there? Why do developers feel like we can't do threat modeling in DevOps? And what can I do about that? So I started thinking about the problem. And I went back to this book. Any of you who've ever worked in threat modeling, it's fairly likely that you've heard of or maybe even seen and read this book by Adam Shostak. It is kind of the Bible on threat modeling. It is the definitive guide for how do you implement threat modeling. Now, it was written many years ago. If I recall correctly, I think the original version was 2015, or it might have even been earlier than that. And so it's largely stood the test of time. But unfortunately, a lot of the processes and things that are talked about, people haven't really evolved it as they've gone more into this idea that we call DevOps. And so you read through that book, it starts off with, and it talks about a lot of different basically heavyweight concepts and methodologies for how we do threat modeling. There's this idea of, first of all, the DFD diagram, the data flow diagram, that we're going to map out the entire system and where all data flows within that system. Then we're going to create these attack maps. And these attack maps talk about what are all the possible ways that someone might try to attack that system that we just mapped out in our DFD. And so you create all of these different attack vectors and you think about all the possible ways somebody might technologically attack your system. And then we take those and we break them down into threats. And we have this framework called STRIDE, where we have very technical categories in which we're going to categorize each of those threats: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. All of these are very technical terms, and they start to lose the business context a little bit. But that's not enough. Then we built this other framework called DREAD, where now we're going to talk about the nature, the types of these threats and the attacks, and how do they play together. So we've got damage. They could cause, are they reproducible? Are they exploitable? Who's affected? Just are they discoverable? Can they be detected? All these things that just further describe the threats. And so this all becomes this massive methodology for how we build a threat model. We create all these threats and we analyze them. And we do this in a point in time, usually somewhere early in the life cycle. But then we create all this, and now we have to understand it. So to understand it, we created this thing called the CAPAC taxonomy to try to really categorize all the threats. And it's as complex as what you see there. So the problem is that kind of thinking is so 2008, because what happened in 2008? A couple guys in Belgium came up with this thing called DevOps. How do we get developers and operations working together to make software delivery happen fast? How do we do it quickly? How do we work together? How do we create this collaboration where dev and ops are working to move software into production quickly and just speed up this process, make life easier for developers? Well, with all that complexity and all this point in time, design-based thing, we lost that design lifecycle altogether in DevOps. That you don't see it here. You don't typically see design. Those long design cycles don't happen in DevOps. And so how do we get back to doing threat modeling when this is our goal? So I decided, let's go back to basics. I kind of asked two simple questions. First of all, at its core, what even is threat modeling? How do we describe it? Like, what is it? Can we define this thing? And then second, why? Why do we threat model? Why is this thing so important? If I'm going to say we need this new way to do threat modeling in DevOps, I need to understand these two questions. So I went to Google and I did some searching, and right away OWASP pops up, Open Web Application Security Project. Many of you are probably familiar with like the OWASP Top 10 and whatnot, but OWASP also has a lot of information on threat modeling. But this was their definition. The definition is complex as threat modeling itself. Oh my gosh, I'm not even going to read this to you, but you don't even have to read it. You get the hint. Look at how long this is and how complex this is. And it focuses on, again, all these technical things like denial of service and failure of storage devices and things. No, this doesn't work. So, okay, where else could I go? Well, Wikipedia is great. Wikipedia's got all this wonderful information. And if we find it on Wikipedia, we know it's true, right? So what does Wikipedia say threat modeling is? Well, again, really complex. It's a little better. It's a little shorter. It's less technically focused. And it starts to draw in, I guess, on some of the more core concepts of what threat modeling is. But still, this is a lot to digest. And I needed something more basic, something simpler. Like at its core, what really is threat modeling? Well, Adam Shostak wrote that book on threat modeling, kind of the definitive guide. And he worked at Microsoft, and it became part of the Microsoft SDL. So what does Microsoft say threat modeling is? Well, it's thankfully easier to understand, but it's still kind of complex. I mean, look at this. It's, identify threats, attacks, vulnerabilities, and countermeasures that could affect your application. You could use it to shape your application's design, meet your security objectives, and reduce risk. God, this is still a mouthful. I wanted something simpler. So I got to thinking, what is threat modeling? And then it hit me. At its core, threat modeling is nothing more than answering the question, what could possibly go wrong? As I consider my system, what are the things that could possibly go wrong? It seems so obvious and so simple, but I hadn't thought of this before. So then I started okay, now how do I put this into a definition that says what it is and why we do it? And I finally found the definition that made sense to me. Threat modeling is identifying the likely threats to a system to inform the design of security countermeasures. That's it. That's what threat modeling is. We want to understand our system, understand what those likely threats are, so that as we're developing that system, we can design security countermeasures that will counteract those threats. Now, where did I find that particular definition? Well, I didn't find it. I had to write it myself. But this is the core of threat modeling. This is what it means, and this is why it's so important. But there's more. So what do I mean, first of all? How does this fit into designing countermeasures? Well, I start with this threat information, right? So I'm going to create this threat model. I'm going to identify these likely threats. I do that early on in my delivery lifecycle or my delivery pipeline because I want that information available as soon as I get to that planning phase. My planning phase, that's when I'm pulling together my sprints and I'm starting to think about, as a developer, how I'm going to build this functionality or meet these requirements. So when I have that threat information, as I'm kind of planning out my development, I can also plan the security requirements that need to be included in what I'm going to develop. That's a very DevOps-y way of looking at things. But when I have the threat modeling information available for me, now security can be a part of it, and suddenly now it's DevSecOps. But it doesn't stop there. It moves into my build process. When I'm building, now I know these are the security controls that I'm going to build as a part of this process. But it continues. What about the testing phase? Well, with that threat information and with the information about the security controls and requirements that I built into my design as I was coding this software, now my test teams, those QA folks, can use that information to build detailed test cases that appropriately address the things that are most crucial from a security perspective. So that's awesome. But what about further down the pipeline? What about when I get to deployment? I can use that same information now as I'm designing monitoring in my post-production environment. I can develop that monitoring capability based on, again, those threats and those controls, those attacks, the things that I need to be most aware of in my application. So this is where this becomes so important. But there's more. And indeed, there's reality to this. To help you understand it better, at the beginning of this year, Puppet released their 2019 State of DevOps report, and they worked collaboratively with Circle CI. They also included Splunk and some sponsors. One of the things they looked at was what security practices impact the security posture of an organization the most. And they mapped it on this quadrant that you see here. The frequency of how often the practice is conducted on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the importance of that particular practice in improving security posture. Now, if you look all the way in the lower right here, not done as often, but the single most important security posture, I know it's hard to read, but that's threat modeling. That's security teams and development teams collaborating together on threat model is the most impactful when it comes to security posture. So this is why threat modeling is important. Now, what if I told you that you can do this without breaking your DevOps pipeline? That's why we're here today. That's what I want to talk to you about. And I want to share with you a method for how we do this and how we bring threat modeling back into the pipeline in a way that doesn't break the pipeline and, in fact, actually enables it, handles all those little pieces of informing our development and our testing and our deployment so that we can do those things better and so that we can be more secure. That's what threat modeling is there for. Now, it all starts with an important concept, and this is something we have to acknowledge. When we talk DevOps, or we talk DevSecOps in particular, we as an industry, whether you're in development, whether you're in security, whether you're in operations, we become a little hyper-focused on tooling. How do I automate? How am I going to make this pipeline happen faster and more efficiently by putting in all the tools to make things automated? But that's not what DevOps or DevSecOps were ever meant to be. If we go back to 2008, when those guys first came up with this concept and started talking about it and writing about it, DevSecOps is always meant to be a culture, which means it's a mix of people, process, and technology. It's the tooling and governance that goes along with that. All of this combined creates a culture where developers, security personnel, operations personnel, even business personnel work together with this idea of a shared responsibility for delivering software efficiently, delivering it securely, and delivering stable software in that post-production environment. This is what DevOps is all about. So when I start to think of this idea of how important collaboration is and in improving my security posture, this is why. Because we work so much better when we work collaboratively with the same goals in mind. We break down those silos of all these different disciplines, and we're all focused with the same goals, the same responsibilities. We're all tracking to that same end. And that's how we need to start developing our methodology around DevOps, DevSecOps, and make threat modeling a part of that. So when we think about traditional threat modeling, I alluded to this before. Now, this is a graphic I've seen in a number of different areas. I don't actually want to say who I pulled this one from because I'm not trying to shame anybody. But this is how we traditionally thought of threat modeling. You had this design phase, and it was in that design phase, that's where we did threat modeling. But as we already talked about, in DevOps, we don't have those long design phases. In fact, the closer and closer we get to CI/CD environments, the more that fades away. The more that we have developers who are taking requirements from a user story and having to just simply take that information, plan out what they're going to develop, and develop it on their own. So we need to move away from this kind of thinking. This kind of thinking is old waterfall type approach that isn't compatible. This is why developers look at threat modeling and say, this isn't compatible with the work that I do anymore. So I can't do threat modeling in my DevOps. Well, they're not wrong. The fact of the matter is, for most people who've launched a DevOps pipeline, this is their goal. We're trying to get to this idea of continuous integration, continuous deployment, where we're failing fast, we're finding those failures, and we just fix them as we go. We're no longer taking all this time in different phases to build designs and document and do all these huge things that really suck up developers' time. We want developers and operations and security working together to make this flow as fast as possible. So we're continuously integrating new changes. We're continuously deploying those changes. We're monitoring them for failure, and we're using those to inform our next development phases. CI/CD is a very valiant goal. This is the reason why we become hyper-focused on tooling sometimes, because tooling and automation is so important in achieving this level of speed. But I posit for you that when we want to bring security into this, we need to focus on one more, the other CI. Now, what is that other CI? We know continuous integration. We know continuous development. Alyssa, what is this other CI you're talking about? I'm talking about continuous improvement. When we think about threat modeling in particular, we think about this idea, this methodology of we're going to threat model the entire system because we're going to identify all the threats and attacks across that entire system, and we're going to address them all. We've got to move away from that thinking as security people. We got to move away from that thinking whenever we're talking DevSecOps. We need to be thinking about how do we make ourselves more secure tomorrow than we are today. That's how we base our goals. We're never going to secure the entire system. We know that already. It doesn't work. It's not realistic. We need to focus on continuous improvement. So if I want to focus on continuous improvement, I need to, stop me if you've heard this one before, push left. Yeah, we talk about that all the time in security. We've been talking about it for 2 decades. Push left, push left, push left. How do we get earlier in the life cycle? How do we get earlier in the pipeline than where traditionally, we think about this planning phase? How do we make sure that we have that threat information available when developers enter their planning phase? Well, the farthest left we can possibly push in that pipeline It's the user story. Remember, I said business can be involved here before. Who writes your user stories? It's your business folks. Why don't we have business more involved in this idea of threat modeling? Think about this for a minute. If we build a small threat model into each of our user stories, limit the scope of threat modeling to just that user story that I'm going to implement, suddenly it's not so heavyweight. Suddenly I'm not focused on securing the entire system. I'm focused on just securing this digestible piece, getting a little better tomorrow than I am today. That idea of continuous improvement. And that's what I'm basing my goals off of. So we need to start thinking about how we build threat information into our user story. Obviously, with as complex as threat modeling is, and if I'm talking about only one user story, this idea of these complex data flow diagrams that map out our entire system, they're not realistic anymore. We can't do that. It's not going to work. So we need to think about it differently. What do I do instead of having this big complex data flow diagram? Well, remember I said, hey, threat modeling is all about what could possibly go wrong. So if I'm going to ask my business people to start building threat information into my user stories, well, what I want them to ask is, what's the worst thing that could happen? Take a look at this user story that you're presenting. It calls for new functionality. It develops new requirements. Well, based on those requirements and that new functionality, what is the worst thing that could happen to the business if that new functionality, if those new requirements are attacked? So now we're getting back to that idea of business context. And this is where we need to think about things differently. Instead of trying to think about IT assets and data and where it flows, we have to think about what is most critical to the business. Is it private data? Are we storing private data somewhere? Is it critical functions? Is it financial assets? Maybe it's people. How often do we really think about the people in our organization as something that we have to defend from threats? And then finally, what are the secrets that we have to defend? So when it comes to documenting threats within our threat model that's going to be in a user story now, we need to stop thinking about complex data flow, and we need to instead focus on those business assets that are most critical to us. You can use these 5 here. You may tailor others to your organization, but they should all have business context and be directly applicable to what means the most for the business. If my business is delivering electricity, that critical function of delivering electricity is my most critical asset. So that's something I need to look at in terms of threats. So then moving on, when I start to actually consider what the threats are going to be to those critical assets, I need to toss out this idea of stride. Unfortunately, stride, as I said before, you see it here, it is so heavily focused on these technical categories and laying things out. And honestly, for any of you who've done threat modeling before, you can probably cite stories where people got into long, arduous discussions over where does a particular threat fit into one of these categories. That's not productive. That's putting this framework ahead of the goals of our threat modeling. So we need to move away from that. And if I'm going to ask business people to put this stuff into a user story, I don't want them having to understand whether this particular threat it falls under information disclosure or tampering. That's not where I want to see that. I don't care if it's repudiation or spoofing. It doesn't matter. And that's not stuff I want to have them focused on. I want the business context from them. I want them to tell me, is there a threat of theft? Is there a threat of fraud? Am I concerned about data being exposed? Or what about interrupted business? Talking again about those critical delivery methods. These are the types of things I want to have defined in that user story. These are the kinds of things that my business folks can understand, but a developer can easily look at this and say, you know what? I can take these items now. I can take these critical assets. I know where they fit in my implementation or where they're going to fit in my implementation. I can think about and understand in very simple terms the concepts of theft, fraud, exposed data, interrupted business. So I can now, and as I'm planning as a developer, I can really conceptualize this much easier than something that was broken down into stride. This tells me something. Now, as a developer, I can use my creativity to think about how am I going to address this. Now, traditionally in threat modeling, your next step after you've got the actual threats and assets identified is you're going to map out this attack vector, right? You're going to do this attack tree. You're going to think about what are all the ways that somebody might, attack this system. And again, these can get very, very technical. Now, in this case, they're talking about a safe, and they're using this as a simplified example. You might pick the lock, you might learn the combination, you might cut open the safe. It might be installed improperly. And these are all ways that someone could attack that safe. We try to do that in software development when we threat model, but it gets really complex really fast. And again, it gets so focused on the technical aspects that it doesn't really help us when we ask a developer to try to build a countermeasure for it. So how can I get developers to think about this differently? And what I tell people is, you've defined an asset. You need to protect that asset from specific threats. So now, when you think about how you're going to do that, you need to design 3 types of security controls for each asset that you're trying to protect. So first and foremost, you're going to take those business assets that your business person, whether it's an analyst or whoever, puts in that user story. You're going to translate those to where they fall within your implementation. And then you're just going to build 3 types of controls for each one of them. The first is your detection control. You need some form of control that says, this is how I'm going to detect if this particular asset is being attacked. This can be just simple monitoring. It could be logging. It could be some type of advanced behavior analytics if you want. But what is appropriate based on that particular asset? Something so that you can tell if an active attack is occurring. And not you, but the folks that are monitoring this. Remember, we're talking about threat modeling, defining our monitoring. This is what's going to enable that monitoring. But you need to go beyond just detection. Second, we need to build mitigation defenses. These are those defenses that are meant to give us time to stall that attack so that we can respond. So how can I build controls? How can I segregate different functionality within my application, whether I'm using microservices or whatnot? How am I going to segregate these critical functional areas so that if someone attacks them, it's going to take them some time before they're able to breach it? And I have that time to detect and react. And then finally, the last control I need are those preventative defenses, those active defenses that are going to go out there after I identified that attack that's incoming. I know that I've got some time to respond to it. I need the capability to go in there and do something about it. So I need an active defense. And of course, these are going to vary based on the asset that you're dealing with and the types of threat that you're trying to defend against. But this is how we want developers thinking. This is how we want our security and our monitoring folks thinking about these threats. When we address them in this way, this is how we get continually better. And we can track this over time, and we can see that we're getting more secure day over day. That's how we start to use threat modeling within DevOps. Now, it's about time for me to wrap up. But before I do, first of all, I want to leave you with this quote. I haven't been able to find attribution for this quote, but I love it because it speaks to everything that we've tried to do for far too long when we try to put security into DevOps. We've focused on trying to do security the way we always have. But we can't change where we're headed if we keep doing the same things that got us here, which is these advanced pipelines that security has a really difficult time fitting into. So I encourage you, think about this differently. Think about how instead of the hyper focus on all these technical aspects, we can really focus on that collaboration and understanding this in terms of what it means to our business, the users, and the functionality of the software we're building. Finally, I want to invite you to reach out and continue the conversation with me. You see my Twitter handle up here. You also see me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect. I would love to have you connect with me. My website, like I said, my blog is pretty far behind, but I also do publish my speaking engagements and so forth out there. So if you ever want to see videos of past ones or know where I'm talking next, please check it out. I really do love to interact with all of you. And then special thanks to Avocado Labs and Auth0 for having me today. Special thanks as well to my employer, Sneak. Really appreciate their support in having me be here as well. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining today. I really hope this was something that you find useful. And I definitely, again, welcome further discussion down the road. If you've got questions, reach out to me. Let me know, and I'll be happy to share ideas and talk further. So with that, thank you so much.